Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first session of AusCERT2022, the 21st year of this conference. My name is Valdemar Jacobson from Business Aspect, and I'll be your chair for the vendor stream for this conference. Just a reminder to everybody, both here and online, we're using the conference app to field questions, and if we've got time at the end, I'll be relaying those back to the speaker. And I think that's probably all I've got in terms of key notices at this point in time. For the first session, we've got Alex Tilley, cybercrime fighter extraordinaire, updating us on his latest views on what's been going on recently. Please welcome Alex.
Thanks, mate. Thank you very much. Am I coming through? We're good? Sweet. Thanks heaps for having me. This is a bit of a different presentation than I sort of normally do. I sat down, I've been doing this for a long time, and I thought about how cybercrime has evolved and changed over the last 20 to 25 years. And I thought I'd try and sort of contextualize it for people because there are a lot of people who are relatively new to this space. And I say relatively new, meaning less than 10 years, less than 15 years. They're not as old and bald as me. So I thought I'd give you a bit of a history lesson so we can understand how we got where we are and what we did to advance our detections and preventions and all that sort of stuff to get to where we are now. So who I am, been doing this for a while, casinos, AFP for a good period of my life, and now I head up APJ research for threat intelligence for SecureWorks. And I don't know anything else than this. I did sit down one day and sort of thought to myself, well, if all this cybercrime stuff goes away, what else could I do? And I really can't do anything else. So I'm kind of stuck in this niche I've dug for myself. But I seem to be pretty good at it. So how I thought I would frame this discussion is around loss per event. So we talk about loss per fraud event, loss per attack event, loss per crime event, and sort of go way back to when I first started this out, and we talked about $500. So back in sort of the early 2000s, about 2002, I was just starting out as a security analyst, a network security analyst back at the time, and this thing called phishing started to happen. Now, I need you to all go with me on this and understand that when I talk about some of these attacks from 15, 20 years ago, we didn't have the detections that we have now. We didn't have the nice seams and all these automated systems. So we were working with Notepad and maybe a spreadsheet if you're lucky. So don't think we were dumb. We just didn't have the stuff that you guys have these days. We built that stuff. So the interesting part about dumb phishing, which is really basic, PHP writes out stolen credentials to a text file stored on a hacked site somewhere. But the time it started happening was around the time when we were first rolling out internet banking. Now, internet banking is an interesting one because as financial institutions, we wanted people to want to use internet banking, right? And I'm not telling stories out of school, this is old enough now, but the basic maths was if you went into a branch to do a transaction, it cost the bank about $5, roughly. If you do the same transaction online, it cost the bank about 5 cents. So at the time it was make people have confidence in the channel. That was the big buzzword, was confidence in the channel. Make people want to use internet banking. And then this phishing stuff started coming out and all hell broke loose. The panic was palpable. Because what if people don't trust internet banking? What if people don't want to use internet banking to do their transactions? What if they go back to branches, God forbid? So we worked very quickly to try and get these phishing sites taken down because it was massive amounts of panic. Now, as I said, they were really basic sort of phishing sites at the time, but they still work. The little Easter egg in the slide is the date on that one is sort of mid last year. This stuff still works, right? But as responders, we started to build up a bit of a database, a bit of an understanding as to what these sites were, how they worked. There were certain kits that you'd see time and time again. And as you started to work with site owners who have been compromised, basically begging them to take it down, you'd start to get copies of the zip file. The basic idea was WordPress vulnerability, upload zip file or tarball, expand, send out phishing emails, go make some money. So we built up these nice little lists of where they would store the credentials locally. As I said, they'd write them out to a text file, right? So result.txt or whatever would have it. So as responders, you just browse to that, go /result.txt and get all of your customer information that was being stolen by the bad guys. And that was the game, all right? It worked pretty well. Wasn't terribly hard. And it was whack-a-mole. Again, it wasn't automated at this stage. We were starting to write some scripts, but it was really sort of manual processes about finding site owners and asking nicely and being polite, that sort of stuff. It really wasn't that hard. And then the bad guys figured out that we were starting to get their text files, and they wrote basic stuff like this, which is a basic mailer script, right? So all of a sudden the credentials weren't being stored locally, they were being mailed off-site, right? Made it a bit harder. Now you couldn't just get them, so now you had to start doing things like reverse lookups and try and figure out, okay, well I spotted one account that's been defrauded, what other accounts did that IP log into, and assume that those are all compromised. And this is just computer stuff, basically. But the crooks adapted, and they started to use captures and these sort of things. So at this time, there was a real business in takedowns because all these companies out of America and Israel, etc., were starting to see they can make some money out of this because it was starting to become a bit of a problem because it's confidence in the channel problem, right? So then we moved to $5,000 per fraud event. Phishing goes on a couple of years, about 3 years later, 2 years later, this thing called Rockfish comes along. Hands up, who knows what Rockfish is? Wow, okay, 2 people, great. Rockfish was the bane of our existence at the time. So Rockfish was basically, you took this concept of a dumb phishing site that was hosted on a compromised site, and you goosed it up on steroids. So all of a sudden you had not just one brand and one phishing site, you had dozens of brands around the world and multiple hundreds of phishing sites all at once. Now Rockfish was the dawn of this type of, I sort of want to say, industrialized phishing. But you'd always know that you were being rockfished because the URL would be a long URL /r/r1 or /rock, and then your bank brand, right? And genuinely, as a little security analyst, you'd see that come through in the morning and you'd know you're going to have a really bad day. Because what Rockfish was also doing was they'd industrialize the actual phishing campaigns, but they'd move themselves to one layer of abstraction from the actual phishing. So rather than you just taking down the phishing site, even if you could get hands on that first layer, all you were getting was an Nginx proxy with an open VPN tunnel. Because they'd moved the actual collection to one layer backwards because they were figuring out how we were going against them, right? So rarely you'd get anything other than just those configs. And as responders who deal with this stuff a lot, I think everyone in this room would understand that after a while, you really can infer a hell of a lot from an open VPN config and an Nginx config because you have to. You've got nothing else to go on. You're just trying to sort of grasp at straws of these little config things and try and figure out where the infrastructure's sitting and what it's doing and who's connecting to what. So you sort of start to learn a lot about getting sort of inferences out of not much data. But that moving to like a different tiered setup really did hamper things. So now we're going after IP takedowns and IP blocking because that's what you could do. You could get where that initial phishing site was hosted and you try and block that or take that down from an IP layer because the domain was gone and the actual collected credentials were at an arm's length backwards. Then we had this thing called fast flux and avalanche. Now I need to really reiterate what I said before, which was this was early days, right? Now people these days look at fast flux, or also known as round robin DNS, and they're like, oh yeah, cool, it's called hosting these days. But back in these days, it wasn't called hosting, it was called fast flux. And the idea being, if you look, so remember we were going after IP takedowns at this stage because domain takedowns were gone and friendly site owners were gone, so we're now at IP takedowns. Crooks say, okay, well you want to resolve phishingsite.com, here's 5 IP addresses. A university in Brazil, a DSL router in Germany, something in a hosting provider in America, something on Roadrunner, and that's it. A minute later you resolve the same domain, 5 new IP addresses. Because the domain is fluxing through IP addresses. Now this is going to be old hat to everyone in this room, but at the time it was new. So then you start to see, okay, well, I can't take down this IP because it's now on thousands of IP addresses. Every time I look up the domain to try and do a takedown, it's on a new 5,000, 600,000 IP addresses. So, okay, well, what if we killed the domain? Sometimes we can get the domain index domain, right? Well, yes, except you get this concept of double flux, which is now the crooks aren't just fluxing the actual hosting part of it, they're also fluxing the NS servers, the name servers. So you're trying to do takedowns on name servers that are also fluxing through these networks of hundreds of thousands of computers around the world. Starts to get interesting, right? So remember I talked before about doing detection based on, well, what account did that IP log into, and let's work backwards and see what other accounts that IP's logged into to try and detect the fraud, right? Well, now you get triple fluxing, which is where they're also fluxing the computers that they use to log in to check the accounts. And all of these are behind this thing which came to be known as avalanche. Now, again, hands up, who knows what Avalanche was? Okay, cool. Avalanche, around 2006, Avalanche really came into its own. It was the real first bulletproof hosting on a commercial scale. Like, bulletproof hosting existed. I'm not saying this was the first ever, but for commercial crime, Avalanche Network was one of the first real sort of commercial bulletproof hosting providers because of the way it was architected. It was a network of, I think at its peak it was a couple of 100,000 different computers around the world. They were all dedicated to various parts of this fluxing stuff, of hosting criminal infrastructure or acting as proxies or acting as name servers or whatever, parts of the criminal landscape. And Avalanche went on and on for, I just didn't saw myself out there, weird. Avalanche went on and on until about 2016. So Avalanche was finally taken down in 2016, genuinely, and I'd forgotten it existed because I'd moved on, but Avalanche stayed. And in 2016, they, in Ukraine, Gennady Kapkanov, who was the last remaining admin of Avalanche, was raided by the SBU SWAT, or SBU Special Soggies, basically. But those are his guns. He was shooting back at the Soggies as they were coming through the front door. And then he jumped over a fence and ran down the road. Interesting thing about that is when he was brought up on charges before a judge, apparently the judge dismissed the charges. So apparently you can just shoot at the cops and run a massive crime network in the Ukraine, it's all fine. What I understand is that later on down the track, he was rearrested and recharged and reconvicted from there. But at the time, it was all a bit interesting. Not that I'm saying anything. I don't say anything. But it was all a bit interesting. So Fast Flux and Avalanche was a really big deal. Trying to do things like that reverse lookups and reverse checking of fraudulent accounts became sort of, useless basically. And we started to do things like, injecting dummy accounts, that sort of stuff, and it wasn't really sort of effective because Avalanche was big time. And Avalanche was around that $5,000 per fraud event. Because as Avalanche would be successful and you had Rockfish on top of Avalanche, there's really starting to be a very, very much of an industrialized phishing infrastructure, really starting to get some money out. So then we move on to 50 grand per fraud event. So 50 grand is around 2007, 2008, and to the banker Trojans. Evgeny Bogachev, the guy who wrote Zeus, still on the loose, still a free man to this day. But banker Trojans were written basically as a response to phishing takedown stuff. The idea was, listen, we got this cool phishing infrastructure, we got this cool hosting infrastructure, but things keep getting taken down and we need to be a bit more nimble about how we do this. But we've realized we can make a lot of money out of this fraud stuff, right? So this guy and some others wrote things called Zeus, Bugat, NetHell, Gauzy. These are things that we called at the time banker Trojans or info stealing Trojans. So these are basically, the idea was rather than a phishing email, it was something that you get infected with and it would hook into your web browser. Now, I'm not going to go through too much detail about that because who really cares? It just works. But I did want to tell you a story about one of the best web injects I ever saw. So the idea of a banker Trojan is to get on your machine and hook into your web browser, right? So then when you browse to when you browse to the domain of a list of configured domains of whatever banks, it does an action. Now the action is what's called a web inject. And again, pardon me if I'm telling you how to suck eggs, but I want to tell you a story here. The web inject is the bit that, as you load up that bank's website, it says, okay, look through the code, and at this point in the code, inject this. So the user's experience stays lovely and the same. They've got the green padlock that we've all told them to trust means good, and they load it up and everything's fine, right? But in there somewhere is the bad guy's code. It's called a web inject because it's injecting itself, right? Now, the best web inject I ever saw was a web inject that basically sort of said, you logged into your bank, an Australian bank, and it said, stop, you've been given $10,000 by accident. The ABA says that you have to give that $10,000 back, or you can be charged with whatever. This is inside your bank's website. Okay, cool. First thing you do, transaction summary. Yep, there it is. Last night, $10,000 from this account into my account. Second thing you do, account balance. Yep, my account balance is $10,000 more than it should be. Okay, nice big red button comes up and says, give the money back or you can't do anything else. Okay, I'll give the money back, right? It populates it with the account that sent you the money and you send $10,000 to that account, right? Cool, on with your day. That's all recorded in your transaction history, it's all nice and neat. Problem is, none of that was real, right? None of that happened. But what has happened then is the punter has just defrauded themselves. Now the beauty of this is, well, not beauty, pardon me, the horrendous part of this is that no matter what control you put in place, no matter what hoop you put in place for that punter to jump through to make that transaction happen, they're going to do it because they want to do the transaction. They have to do the transaction. You can do a two-factor token, you can do an SMS message, you can do a phone call, if all these sort of things you can do, but the punter wants to do it. So all of those controls you put in basically get rendered null and void by what is, in essence, a social engineering trick. But then it gets even worse. Those changes to your transaction history and those changes to your bank balance persist. So as long as you're infected with this was actually Citadel, but as long as you're infected with this version of a Zeus Trojan that is doing it, it will persist those changes. So you will always think that you've got $10,000 more than you've got until it comes time for you to buy that car or that expensive fridge or whatever, and they say, no, you haven't got that much money. It's like, yeah, I do, it's right here. And you actually, God forbid, you call your bank or you request a paper statement. That transaction never happened. All you did was send $10,000 to someone. So that's just an idea as to the power of these web injects and why we always say they're the warhead on the missile. Like the actual malware itself is just the fuel and the engine bit. The bit that does the damage is that little bit of JavaScript, that little bit of HTML that's 40, 50 lines long. That's what does the actual damage. Very hard to detect, right? From a banking point of view, very hard to detect because you have to now start doing things like, okay, well, what's in the DOM of the browser on the victim's edge? I know how much code I sent them to render this banking site, but the only way that I can really tell is by saying, okay, well, hey, web browser at victim's end, how much code do you have? And then compare the lines. If there's a delta there, maybe they're being injected. This is old stuff, by the way, so this has got better now. I'm not sort of speaking out of school, but this is the thing we have to start to do, right? Because these web injects were massively bad, really. So we started to do this sort of stuff. That's banker Trojans. But what we're talking about now is, fraud events at around the 50 grand per pop because they had complete control. And this is mostly retail banking, mum and dad banking, moving a bit into business banking because they're starting to sort of see that there's some money there. At this stage, we still had things like daily limits and international transfer restrictions, all that sort of stuff. But at this stage, it was something a bit new. Totally took phishing out of the equation. So then, that worked really well. And that brought in this thing called JabberZeus. Again, hands for JabberZeus? Anyone? A couple? Great. Same two guys. JabberZeus basically took that whole process and automated it via using Jabber, XMPP. It was using instant messaging. So these crooks have figured out, we can sit there and we don't have to make a decision. We can let the victim's computer tell us, hey, I've got a Suncorp victim that's got 10 grand in the account, what do you want to do? And using Jabber, they could say, well, take 5 grand or take, $2,500. Here's a mule, that sort of stuff. So it really sort of automated that sort of control of the fraud process, as it were. And it was really, really, really effective. Like JabberZeus was a dirty word for a lot of us at the time. And JabberZeus born this thing that is the best tool that no one's ever heard of. It's called Leprechaun. Leprechaun was an add-on to JabberZeus. And I'm telling you history lessons because I want to sort of tell you how these things kept growing, right? Leprechaun add-on to JabberZeus even further automated it. Leprechaun would get told a series of parameters. And as victims logged into websites, it would act on those parameters and automatically make those transfers. Parameters like daily limit, percentage of account balance, account type, destination mule type, that sort of stuff was all automated. And Leprechaun would just go, yep, cool. So, and when JabberZeus was really at its peak, it moved from a, do you want to commit fraud, to a, hey, I've just committed fraud, alerting model. Which was really interesting for the responders because you had no time now. Because the actual crooks weren't doing the crime, Leprechaun was doing the crime for them and just alerting them that, hey, I've already stolen 5 grand for you or 50 grand for you. It was a really interesting time. So that, and ACH is automated clearinghouse, that's like the American term for like automated transfers. So that led to this operation called Trident Breach, which Trident Breach did have impact. They arrested a bunch of people. But at the time, the problem was when we'd have these operations, and I was in law enforcement at the time, you'd have these operations, they were great, they took a long time, they were really hard to do, genuinely, but it would always be mules, the money mules. People actually would cash out the money and give it to the criminal syndicate. That's where you would have impact, because money mules are stupid creatures. And I say that qualifiedly. So you would always get the mules. In this case, you would also get the mule handlers. Funnily enough, some of these dudes, so the one in the middle there, the head, and this guy, Tank, they were involved way back at Rockfish. So they were growing up with the crime, and they were growing up with us reacting to them and generating new and interesting ways to commit fraud. In this stage, they were implicated as mule handlers. So anyone who's ever been a mule or handled mules knows that handling mules is the hardest part. Wrangling is like herding cats, literally, trying to get these people to make these transactions and be available to accept this money and cash. That's the hardest part. So that's really time, it takes a lot of time to do it. So at this stage, these guys were doing the mule handling stuff. And yeah, it was always mules, and it was mules that got arrested. But it was still good work. It was tremendous work, because Jabberzeus was massively bad for everyone. Then we move on to $500,000 per fraud event. So now we're getting a bit more modern times, right? This thing called Game Over Zeus and this thing called Dyer come along. And Game Over Zeus was wicked. It was the evolution of all of the stuff we've seen before into this almost perfect fraud tool called Game Over Zeus. And at the same time, this thing called Dyer emerged. Now, why I mention these things is because they'd taken all of the tricks about being fully automated, and they'd have this really, really robust and really well-matured muling infrastructure, because, as I said, it's hard to do muling, but now you're talking about actual money laundering, like as in money laundering syndicates that launder money for drugs, for prostitution, for all kinds of crime. You just pour money into them at this end, and money comes out at that end, and it goes through all these things in the middle. But they take a lot of percentage, and it takes a while to get to get into cahoots with these people. So once they got into cahoots, the floodgates are open. Now it's just about how much money can I pump through these networks. So we shift as attackers. We've got all these cool tools and cool tricks we've learnt, but now we shift from retail banking. Now I'm going after business banking. I'm going after wealth management. I'm going after self-managed super funds in Australia. I'm going after where there's some real friggin' money. Because I've got all this back end set up now to pump this money through. I just need more of it coming in. So at this stage, when Game Over Zeus and Dyer were really pumping, and I did a lot of work on these things at the time, they weren't even caring about retail banking accounts. They weren't caring about you or my bank account. It was only the top end of town, because they were set up to be able to move that large amounts of money. And when they did it, they really, really did it. So being hooked in with these professional mule crews, as I said, it took away that bottleneck, because the mules are always the hardest bit. Actually getting that 50 grand in your back pocket is the hardest part of cybercrime. Getting access to it is the easiest part. Transferring it's pretty easy as well, but actually getting it in the skyrocket is the hardest part of this. But at this stage, these people were really hooked in. And it was wild times, and it would just be churning through it. And if you ever gone to, I'm not bashing them at all, but you go to certain industries around, let's say superannuation, etc., and you say, hey, bad guys have just transferred 500 grand out, and they say that's impossible. And it's like, well, it happened. And they say, well, we can't, that's not possible. So, well, the crooks figured out how to do it, so now you've got to give someone all their super back. Those are really hard conversations to have, because especially in superannuation, and hopefully it's better now, I'm sure it is because it's more transactional these days, but at that stage, super was very static. It didn't move much. You didn't really change a lot about it, money just sort of sat there. So over years, these systems never really grew or changed, but the bad guys would grow and change and would figure out where the money sat and go after it. So it was interesting times for that in that sort of scenario, but Game Over Zeus was wild. Now, BlitzQWorks and some others contributed to taking down Game Over Zeus. And so this actually, it's a really decent read. This is before my time with the company, but it's a decent read. Is around when we did Game Over Zeus, it was the same guy, Gennady Kapkanov, the guy with the cat. But it was also, he was writing this thing called Crypto Locker. And I was like, that's interesting, what's Crypto Locker? Remember, this is 2014, right? So this is before real ransomware was really a thing. And it was like, all right, Crypto Locker is interesting, that's fine. So now, I haven't got time, and I was going to tell you a story about $500 million, but I won't. But it does involve a meteorite and a challenge coin. Ask me at the bar later, and I'll tell you that story. But I'm running out of time. So we now move to now. Where we are now is $5 million per fraud event, or per loss event. And $5 million per loss event is ransomware, right? So this is, you can see sort of how these things go forward, but this is where, Bogachev got to with writing CryptoLocker. He'd seen the banks were getting better were very good at defending. Banks spend a lot of money on defense, right? Banks are some of the hardest targets to actually do. But what these crooks had figured out over their time is, let's take the bank out of the equation. Let's make this a personal transaction between me and the victim. Because, as I'm sure the consultants in the room know, a lot of companies don't spend a lot of time on security. But if me as the attacker can take the highly secured part about it out of the equation and the insured part about it, the bank's money is insured, if I can take that out of the equation, I can deal one-on-one with the victim and I'm going to really cash out. So that's where we are now, is the crooks have decided, I want to go one-on-one with the victim, I'm going to mug them in the street for $5 million. And it works. As we're all seeing, it works. It's not going anywhere and it's never going to stop. So what's really also interesting there is it's taken that part of the equation out of it, which is the money mules. I now no longer need to give 15% to that money laundering syndicate because I can just get it all myself via cryptocurrency. So it's almost like it's the evolution of criminality to, millennial status, where you've taken all the large infrastructure out of the equation, you're going one-on-one and using cryptocurrency. So it really has taken all those bars of entry out of it, which is why it's happening everywhere. But new and cool, old and dumb still works, right? Like phishing still works. It still happens day to day. So the future, and this is where I sort of wanted to get to real quick, is, I've got a minute and a half. Mobile devices are interesting because the tools to do mobile device bank theft and information theft have existed for years. You remember when Mika Hipponen sort of stood up and said, mobile malware is going to be the next big thing, and everyone panicked and it never really happened? Well, that's sort of what we're seeing bearing out now. So we had this thing called Marcher. Marcher was great. It was a fully featured, basically a banker Trojan for your phone. Cool, it came, didn't do a whole lot, sort of went. Then you had this thing called Exobot, then Anubis. Sort of the same thing, like really, really full-featured mobile banking malware platforms never really took off. But now you have everyone's favorite Flubot, which is taking off. Flubot seems to be where they've sort of got to the point where they're really making that sort of, all the parts coalesce, as it were. And this is getting involved in the old school money laundering syndicates as well. So you have these changes through mobile devices. Now, I genuinely think we've all seen bits and sus used to push out malware to corporate networks, right? We've all seen that happen. Well, mobile device fleet management software is just the same. So in my mind, that's where I'd be going. I'd be locking up an entire fleet for, imagine a mining company's entire fleet of handsets gets locked up overnight. The technology exists to do this. They just haven't done it yet. I haven't got anything to sell you to do that. I'm just saying that's probably what's going to happen next. That's where I'd go. I'd look at these, these large-scale deployment things. And genuinely, I did have more, but I'm running out of time. So I did sort of just want to say, are we winning? Well, it depends on your definition of win. Do we think we're going to win the war on drugs? Do we think we're going to win the war on illegal guns? No, but we as an industry seem to have this hubris that sort of says, well, surely we can beat this. We're smart enough, we've got all this money, surely we can beat cybercrime. It's like, well, why? We can have wins and we can have successes and we can make a difference, but I think everyone in this room would know this isn't going to go anywhere, but we just had a little bit of fun while we're trying to do it, I think, because it's one of those things where I don't think we can win. We can't beat this, but we can definitely have an impact on it and it's worthwhile. But I think, we need to sort of stop using that sort of terminology. With that, thank you for your time. It's a bit of a downer to start the day on, but it is also reality. So thanks for your time. Any questions or am I out of time? I'm getting the hook.
I think unfortunately we're out of time, Alex. But on behalf of AusCERT and the conference, thank you very much on giving us that lovely history lesson and ground in reality of where we're going. The next session in this room is Stephen and Chris from Ground Labs talking about upcoming changes to the Australian Privacy Act, and it'll be in about 5 minutes.